Good people, give ear if you're willing, for I have some stories for you, and the tales that I'll tell, they are good ones, concerning the old and the new. On our trip we will sail all together, through the seas and the rivers of time, and the cargo so precious we'll carry. They are stories in rhythms and rhyme. So come now and meet my companion. We are hoping to not run aground.
Porthleven is positioned at the mouth of a marshy valley, containing a small stream on the southwest coast of Cornwall, 2 miles south of Helston. To the west lies Marazion and St Michael's Mount, and to the east, Low Pool and the Lizard Peninsula. Porthleven is first recorded in a court roll from 1529 as a small fishing village in the shelter of a tiny creek, its name coming from the old Cornish Porth, which means harbour, and Leven, which means level or smooth.
If you wander around Porthleven today, you'll still see evidence of its history. You had the boat building, the fishing, the net manufacturing, and going back much further, the mining. All these things are very much the life and fabric of Porthleven.
By 1700, the fishermen had been joined by farm workers and miners, who worked at the nearby copper and tin mines until their peak in the 1870s.
A lot of the miners living in Porthleven certainly would have walked to Trevorvis mine. And I think to the degree where there were enough miners that they'd actually cut a slot or a trench all the way out to Trevorvis from Porthleven so that they could find their way home winter nights without walking over the cliff. They had about 200 miners working there. And of course, with the depth they were down, 600 feet out, 600 feet down, there would have been a lot of miners working there and as many out on the cliffs, cobbing down the ore and preparing it for export. Most of the copper in Cornwall went to Swansea to be smelted. It took so much coal to smelt copper that it was easier to take the copper to where the coal was and then bring back a load of coal for the steam engines. And so you could do a two-way trip, really. So certainly a lot of the copper would have been exported out of here and coal back in.
From the medieval period until the 19th century, the area of the present harbour consisted of marshland behind a small natural cove, where boats were pulled up onto a shingle beach. A vast number of wrecks were recorded around this coastal area, when ships were driven by prevailing southerly and southwesterly gales and mountainous seas trapping them in Mounts Bay. In January 1796, a large transport bound for Portsmouth with the 26th Dragoons on board parted from her convoy and ran ashore near the rocks of Porthleven. None of the 400 men on board survived. It was in late December 1807 when a severe winter gale caused the wreck of the HMS Anson on the Low Bar. This resulted in the loss of over 120 lives, including the ship's captain Lydiard. This was the catalyst subsequently leading to the construction of Porthleven Harbour.
We know Tobias Roberts was actually on the beach at the time and that he swam out to the Anson with a rope, successfully swam out to the Anson with a rope and created a bridge back for people to be able to get back to safety.
Having witnessed the loss of life, Tobias recognised the need for a harbour of refuge in Mounts Bay. Porthleven Harbour would come to fruition due to this one man's courage and determination.
We know that he communicated with people that wrote to Admiralty and also to communicated with people in Porthleven. We know neither Admiralty or the people of Porthleven really wanted the harbour here.
The following year, in 1808, the Royal Cornwall Gazette wrote that the great number of shipwrecks that happen near the Low Pool make it a matter of astonishment that no attempt has yet been made to render that fine lake a harbour. Low Pool was originally considered for the development of a safe refuge harbour.
The bar itself was actually formed, I think the year was 1302. Prior to 1302, vessels could go up into Helston, St John's in Helston. They used to trade through what is now the Low Pool, which was then an inlet, up to into Helston. So when the bar formed, that obviously stopped, and it would have made actually a very useful harbour there, but it didn't happen.
The engineers realised it would be an impossible task maintaining an open harbour entrance due to the constant shifting of the sands caused by tidal action and the winter storms. After much perseverance, Tobias Roberts won his battle, securing an Act of Parliament in 1811 for the construction of a harbour at Porthleven, and the Porthleven Harbour Company was formed.
Tobias pushed the issues and it was taken up for him, and as a result we had the Harbour Act passed in 1811. The outer harbour was the first part built, and then the inner harbour was added to it afterwards as subsequent acts.
Over the years, the harbour was improved and became not just a harbour of refuge, but created the opportunity for commercial trade, boat building and net making, as well as offering a safe haven for the village's fishing fleet.
So when Porthleven Harbour was built, it was run by the government, and it had a board of governors that ran it. It was then put up for auction and was sold, and then went into private ownership. And the first ones I can recall historically was Harveys of Hale bought it in 1856. And they owned Porthleven for approximately 100 years. And the first thing they did was to build a second jetty in Porthleven across where the gap is. Because the two outer jetties in front of the ship inn was the original harbour entrance. And in a storm, you can imagine, the boats would have been smashed to pieces unless they were taking out the water. But then Harveys built the second fisherman's quay across with a gap in it, as we refer to the gap, where they put the bock timbers down, which then created an inner basin, which was tidal still, but it held boats much safer in there.
Porthleven grew from a small fishing village into a thriving industrial port, importing coal, building materials, agricultural products and limestone, whilst exporting copper ore, tin and china clay.
In 1837, they drew up plans of developing the Low Pool into a harbour. And Low Pool's quite deep. I think it would have been able to take a vessel, it's 75 feet deep, I think, in the centre. So had that gone ahead, Porthleven could well have been a place as big as Falmouth today.
Oh, we'd be all right if the wind was
Porthleven
in our sails,
Smuggling.
we'd be all right if the wind
Cornwall is a land of myths and legends, and like all great stories, they improve with the telling. Some are born out of history, whilst others have no real foundation but are interesting nonetheless. Smuggling was highly organised, from those who sailed to France returning with supplies, to those who received the cargo ready to hide before distribution to customers.
Smuggling over the years, I'm sure, has always been very much part of Cornish life, of Porthleven life, and without any doubt smuggling has gone on, but in its clever nature there's very little ever recorded.
The most famous Cornish smugglers were, without doubt, the Carters from Prussia Cove, and one of Porthleven's oldest families, the Strike dynasty, can trace their family tree back to a branch, the Carter Strikes.
Going back into the 1700s, one of the girls of the Strike family actually married someone by the name of Carter from Prussia Cove. And Prussia Cove always had a very well-known smuggler, John Carter. So maybe that's where the name Carter came into our family. So I would poise not to say that we were involved in smuggling, but I certainly think there's a connection between the name Carter, Prussia Cove, and my family.
Local legend tells there were connecting tunnels from caves and the ship inn to Methley Manor, where it is alleged there was a chamber under the kitchen floor large enough to hide 10 or so smugglers.
We're living and farming at Methley Farm. Beautiful old house that obviously dates back to the Doomsday. As we know, Methley is steeped in history and connected with smuggling. I found some of the tunnels connected mainly as I've walked up them and led back to the water wheel. These have, fascinating to actually get in the tunnel and Not a lot of room, obviously, but a lot of work gone into making these tunnels. And it would be lovely to think that some of these were connected with the smuggling. And it just, when you're actually in the tunnel, you get a feeling of what it would have been like with contraband and how they made a living was interesting.
It was Edward Code lived at Methley. In the custom officer's logbook, he actually applied to move goods around the country. And of course, initially you think, well, that's cheeky. He's actually moving smuggled goods around the country. But in actual fact, if you look at the number of vessels that have been lost over the years, I know in 1851, 701 vessels came to grief around the British Isles in that 1 year alone, which meant I think half of them were broken up. Some of them sank, some of them jettisoned cargo, so there would have been an awful lot of cargo washing ashore all the way along our coastline. So his application to move goods could have been quite a legitimate one, but could also have been a very clever disguise for moving the smuggled goods.
Most houses had simple hiding places for their free trade purchases, whilst others had far more sophisticated purpose-built concealments. The Ship Inn allegedly had numerous escape routes supported by drafts of air from fissures in the rocks. It was also rumoured there were other smugglers' tunnels leading from caves into the harbour area. It is thought some of the Porthleven contraband was stored inland at Sithne. Smuggling in Mounts Bay dates back over 200 years, and in the early 1800s it was estimated that 70,000 gallons of brandy was landed every year. It was recorded that a customs officer returning to Porthleven came across 8 horses laden with smuggled freight. The smugglers beat and stoned the officer, and although a reward of £50 was offered, it was never claimed.
And one quick story, that the custom officers actually came and confiscated some of the smuggled goods from John Carter and took it down and put it into the custom house at Penzance, when sometime immediately afterwards someone had broken in and removed all the John Carter goods. So he'd obviously gone in and taken them back. They knew it was him, but he didn't take anything else. He only took what belonged to him. So, a little story of smuggling.
In 1769, William Odgers, a Porthleven customs officer, was shot dead by Melchizedek Kinsman, a smuggler from Gwenup. Despite a reward for £100 being offered, Kinsman and his 3 associates managed to evade capture for almost a year. To everyone's astonishment, they were found not guilty at their trial in Bodmin. Some believed that members of the jury may have been bribed by Kinsman's family, but local juries were reluctant to convict anyone accused of smuggling, which was known locally as free trading.
Fascinating to look back and think, well, what has happened in the past. If I could have 3 wishes, one of them would be time travelling, and I'd like to have seen what has gone on and what was supposed to have gone on. Methley's steeped in history. People have heard about the stories about smuggling. We were told when we first moved in that there was supposed to be under the kitchen floor, there's supposed to be a hidden room where the smugglers accessed from a tunnel that led from the cliffs actually through and into Methley. We haven't actually seen the evidence ourselves, but I'm sure that it's likely to have gone on.
Farewell and adieu to you.
Storms, wrecks, and disasters. Being the most southerly working port on the mainland of Britain, Porthleven takes a battering during the storm season.
Over the years, the terrible storms coming into Porthleven have gradually eroded away the cliffs, so the sea defences have been built along above the beach. But the design of the harbour was very cleverly designed because it has a 90-degree turn. You actually look at the aerial view of the harbour, it doesn't go straight out, which most people tend to think it does. You actually go through almost 90 degrees coming in, and the pier is built out into it at an angle, so the waves actually fall wider as they're coming in, which is designed to take the sting out of the waves. And the other incidental point about pier is when they started to build the pier, you would naturally do it from the shore outwards. And each time they started to build it, a storm would come up and undo all their work. And it was a visitor that came down and said, the only way you're going to build the pier is to start at the far end and come inwards. And that's exactly what they did. And that's exactly how they got the pier built.
With the southwesterly winds being the predominant direction, large waves arrive from the Atlantic over the Celtic Shelf before entering the Irish Sea and the Channel. Waves of around 100 feet have been experienced in the western approaches. Most people remember the hurricane of 1989 which struck Porthleven. Ever since, the Institute clock tower frequently appears on the national news whenever there is a storm forecast.
Well, we had plenty of fine weather in mind, but we also had, we had a few storms. I can remember being away, 2-3 hours, and Jack was aboard, my Uncle Jack then, and bad weather, and we was dodging. And we was talking to Jack, because he was the older man of the crew, and he was teaching us the ropes about long lining, really. I said, what is going to do here? And Jack, he said, well, you've got 3 options, boy. We can dodge here and see what he's like in the morning, or we can go along quietly and to where we're wanting to be. He said, but it's bad weather. He said, or we can go in Sillies. It's up to you. You decide. I said, well, that's the 3 options. He said, well, you've got that other option. He said, you can turn around and go in like they are. In the end, we decided to do the wise thing and come about and take her inland. Well, we come about that night, and she was a beautiful sailboat, but my word, she dipped in a sail, and the sail cracked over her stern. And he said, I think you're making the wise decision.
It was during these hazardous conditions ships used to seek shelter in Mounts Bay and ended up becoming trapped. In January 1796, a large transport bound for Portsmouth with the 26th Dragoons on board parted from her convoy and ran ashore near the rocks of Porthleven.
Despite huge seas, 9 men of brig joined themselves by rope and waded out towards her, but they were engulfed by a great wave and never seen again. Soon after, the transport broke apart and none of the 400 on board survived.
One particular shipwreck, which was to have a profound impact on a local resident, was the wrecking of the Anson. In 1807, the HMS Anson, a 44-gun frigate ship, was assigned to the Channel Fleet and ordered to help support the blockade of Brest by patrolling off Black Rocks. But while sailing from Falmouth on the 24th of December, a severe storm developed and the captain decided to return to port and made for the Lizard. But the ship became trapped in Mounts Bay near Penzance off the coast of Cornwall. Unable to sail out to the open seas, the ship rolled heavily before attempting to anchor off Low Bar, near Porthleven. The severity of the storm caused the first anchor to snap, and in the early hours of the morning on the 29th of December, the smaller anchor gave way, resulting in the ship being driven onto the shoreline. In an attempt to save lives, the captain of the Anson, Captain Lydiard, attempted to beach the ship, only to discover that it was a sandbar covering the rocks, which divided Low Pool from the open sea. The storm caused the ship to roll and her mainmast snapped. A number of the crew were swept away, whilst others managed to clamber along the fallen mainmast to the shore. Captain Lydiard remained aboard to oversee the evacuation, but around 2 p.m. the ship began to break up, and by 3 p.m. no trace of the ship remained.
She lay on the pounding waves for hours before she finally broke up, and the horror was witnessed by an awful lot of people on the shore, and amongst them was a man by the name of Henry Trengrouse of Helston.
Henry Trengrouse was born in Helston in 1772. After witnessing the appalling loss of life at the wreck of the HMS Anson, he invested around £3,000, £450,000 today, of his own money, devising a method to save life by means of a rocket and line fired from the shore to a vessel in distress.
Henry Trengrouse devoted his life to inventing the life-saving apparatus, which was adopted in Russia and for which he was awarded a purse of gold. But sadly he died a very poor man. He devoted his life to saving life at sea, and it's a shame to see him actually die in such a poor state of finance.
Many more ships have fallen foul of the Lizard with its dense fog and treacherous seas, including the Anemone, which ran ashore on the 12th of November 1920, 50 yards east of the pier. The Ebenezer was wrecked when leaving the harbour on the morning of the 14th of April 1913, when a southwest breeze and a strong flood tide swept her past the pier, over the Trigg rocks and into the breakers, before dashing her onto the rocks at the base of the pier. Even though the crew were all locals and experienced men, they still failed to clear the pier. On the 24th of November 1865, a 325-ton Sunderland barque called William, carrying linseed from Odessa to Falmouth, was wrecked as she ran for the harbour to escape a southerly gale, which had been blowing for 3 days. The captain and the remaining crew, bar 2, were able to clamber to safety.
The Suvic, which was inbound to London from Australia in 1907, that ship ran aground off the Mainhere Rocks, off the Lizard. It wasn't a stormy passage at all. I believe it was fog. Now, alongside Cadgwith, Coverack and the Lizard lifeboats, the Porthleven lifeboat, remember they were oar-driven then, they rowed from Porthleven to the Lizard. It took them 4 hours. They helped to rescue the whole crew and passengers, over 500, brought them safely to shore, and that took 12 hours. And after 12 hours, they rowed back again. But they had help from the tug Eagle, so they had a rest. They didn't have to row all the way home.
On the 26th of December 1912, a 3,641-ton Italian cargo boat, SS Tripolitania, which was bound for Barry Docks in South Wales, ran into a hurricane-force storm in the Bay of Biscay. She was blown towards the Cornish coast, and its captain, finding himself in a perilous position, decided to beach her on low bar. One by one, the crew left the vessel, over which huge waves were breaking, by sliding down the rope and swimming through the waves. One of the men was carried off by a heavy comber and drowned. His body was never recovered, but 27 men made it to safety. The Friezo was a Dutch vessel which hit a rock off Lizard Point, ripping a wide gash in her bow. She was seen limping into harbour after being towed in from Mounts Bay, and fearing that the vessel was about to founder off the port of Porthleven, began to abandon ship. The Brancalo, a 1,661-ton English brigantine, under charter to the Russian government, was carrying a cargo of 3,500 tons of coal when she came ashore on low bar in a gale. The passengers and the crew of 29 made it safely ashore.
Sisters are
Rescue services,
weaving
coast guards and lifeboats.
Sisters, we must part.
The Coast Guard and the lifeboat have an interactive history, working closely together to save lives. Generations of Porthleven families' names are linked with both organisations.
Porthleven's always been renowned for its terrible storms during the winter because it's in the centre of Mounts Bay and the Atlantic storms get funnelled into the centre, which is where Porthleven is situated. And so over the years, the lifeboat service has been of great value, and also the Coast Guard life-saving apparatus has been put to good use during those years.
In 1852, there were 2 Coast Guard stations in Porthleven. The path west to Trawara's Head was known as Coast Guard Path.
The first lifeboat, actually, was stationed in Porthleven in 1863, and there were 4 lifeboats altogether up until 1929, the last being the Dash. My great-grandfather was the cox of the James Francis White, and that went out on one of the most famous shouts in RNLI history. That was the Suvic, which was inbound to London from Australia in 1907.
The old Coast Guard station, built prior to 1862, can still be seen dominating Peveril Terrace. The station stored the LSA equipment, life-saving apparatus. In 1877, the Volunteer LSA was formed and the rocket life-saving apparatus was in use for over 100 years, saving 104 lives. In 1869, the equipment was used successfully for the first time in Porthleven, on the wreck of the Nellie Harding, when it saved the captain's wife and 22 crew members.
I grew up listening to my father talk about the sea, because his great passion was a collection of Cornish shipwrecks, and the brothers got involved with the Coast Guards. The father joined the Coast Guards in 1928. In 1930, he was made number one of the Porthleven LSA, which is Porthleven life-saving apparatus, and put to use in 1931. The last time the rocket was fired here in a rescue was to the little French schooner, the St. Anne, that had spent the day tacking to and fro, trying to get clear of the bay, but in the end the skipper decided, for the safety of his crew, he would run onto Porthleven Beach, and the LSA assembled on the beach, and they fired the line out. And I always remember hearing my father say that the rocket passed right between the two masts, and he thought he'd got contact, but the gale of wind blew the loose line, because when you suddenly pull a rope in the air, it doesn't follow the rocket, it goes out in a big loop, and the loop is where it's got to arrive actually on the ship. But of course it missed it. They had to haul back in, and they fired a second time, and in 13 minutes the crew of 7 were brought ashore, all safely. The first one to come ashore was a little 14-year-old boy who was crying, "Où est ma mère?" He wanted his mother. Well, I can quite understand why, poor fellow.
In 1863, a 6-oared lifeboat was first stationed at Porthleven at the request of a local MP, Mr. F.J. Agar Robarts, and the local people. Mr. Agar Robarts gave £150 towards the cost of the boat, and the lifeboat was carried, free of charge, the whole distance from London to Truro by the Great Western, Bristol, Exeter, South Devon and Cornwall Railway Companies, who were ever ready to aid the institution in every way in their power. The boat was named at the request of the local residents the Agar Robarts, after its philanthropic donor. The West Briton newspaper carried a report on the 27th of February 1863 of the launching of the beautiful new lifeboat at Limehouse in London. The paper wrote that her self-righting and self-ejecting qualities proved to be most satisfactory. On being capsized by a crane, she self-righted and ejected the water from inside her hull through patent valves in 25 seconds. By an ingenious contrivance, the boat with her crew on board is launched off the carriage. With their oars in their hands, they are thus able to obtain headway before the breakers have time to beat the boat broadside onto the beach. On the 24th of November 1865, the William Bark, a 325-ton Sunderland ship carrying linseed from Odessa to Falmouth, ran for shelter at Porthleven. She was wrecked in the outer harbour, but the lifeboat was unable to launch because of the exceptionally heavy seas. But the Coast Guards attended this emergency with their life-saving apparatus.
The sea was vicious, and when the William was off the end of the pier, the bowsprit rested momentarily on the pier, and one of the sailors ran up the bowsprit, jumped onto the pier, and tried to run along to the rescuers who would be back by the buildings there, by the Fishmonger's Arms, the pub. Sadly, he was washed into the outer harbour. John Pascoe went in to try and save him. He got into trouble, and his brother Peter went in after him, so he actually rescued his brother. The RNLI awarded Peter a silver medal and £2, and his brother John, they awarded him £1. Following the wreck of the William, and the fact that this sailor tried to run along the pier, they actually fitted a railings to one side of the pier, because they said had there been a railings on the pier at the time, he could have probably clung onto it. When the wave passed, he could have carried on and run to safety. But they only put it on the beach side. Never been a railings put on the harbour side, because if they put a railings on the harbour side, it would be in the way of towing out the luggers to get them out, to release them, the fishing boats, to release them out at the end of the pier to go off to their fishing. So they used to get towed along the harbour side by, it was called tracking. It was done by anyone who's on the shore, retired fishermen or anyone. But it was following the William, they put the railings on the one side of the pier.
The first launch for the Agar Robarts came on the 5th of December 1866, when it went to the aid of the Finnish bark Salmis. It took the lifeboat crew an hour to pull through heavy seas to the Salmis, which had dropped both her anchors to avoid being driven ashore. They worked the vessel safely out of the bay during the night and into Falmouth, where they were thanked by the captain, his wife, and the 16 crew for saving them.
In 1882, the 30-foot six-oared boat was replaced with a new and larger boat, a 34-foot keel, 8-foot beam, double-planked, and rowing 10 oars. The cost of the new boat, with its transporting carriage, was defrayed by the legacy of the late Mrs. Elsa Wright of Southport, in memory of her late son, after whom the lifeboat was named the Charles Henry Wright.
The lifeboat served the people of Porthleven until 1900, when it was replaced by the John Francis White, which served until 1926. The coxswain was James Thomas Quick, who was also the harbour master for Porthleven. There are numerous records of their activities, but one particular incident saw the crew of the John Francis White become part of a major rescue mission to save the lives of 523 passengers, when, on the 18th of March 1907, the White Star liner Suvic of Liverpool went aground on the Lizard. The steamship was built by Harland and Wolff in Belfast for the White Star Line, to service on the Liverpool, Cape Town, Sydney route. Carrying 382 passengers and 141 crew members and a nearly full cargo, it ran full tilt into the rocks off the Manhire Reef, just a few hundred yards from the Lizard Point and lifeboat station. Her bow had become wedged between the jagged rocks, which had punched holes in her hull, ensuring that the whole ship was stuck firmly. The flares, accompanied by the eerie sound of a ship's horn rising above the howling gale, were spotted by villagers. During the ensuing 16 hours, the 60 crewmen of 4 wooden lifeboats stationed at Cadgwith, Caverack, the Lizard, and Porthleven made multiple journeys in dense fog and towering seas to bring to safety 456 men, women, and children on board the stricken liner. The rescue continued through the night, with no let-up except between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. when the weather was foulest. The last passenger was brought to safety at midday the next day. Incredibly, not a single life was lost.
Great-grandmother Catherine, whenever the lifeboat went out on a shout, she would always put a lamp in the window, facing out to sea. And but on the particular occasion of the Suvic rescue, it was daylight by the time they came back, middle of the day. So the lamp had been extinguished, but the Coast Guard came running down the road shouting, "It's all right, Miss Quick, they're on their way back," which I thought was lovely. And my grandmother, I remember her telling me that. The lifeboat station closed in 1929 because motor-driven lifeboats came in. And between the Lizard and Penlee, they were able to cover Mounts Bay, so Porthleven was made redundant, which was such a shame.
Although Porthleven no longer has a lifeboat, it still retains strong links with Penlee Station, who attend the annual Lifeboat Day, along with the local Coast Guard team and the search and rescue helicopter.
I had 3 brothers join the Coast Guards. I was the only one of the family that didn't actually get involved with the Coast Guards. And my brother Alec put in, I think, 36 years. His son is in it still, and he's put in a total of 36 years. He got another son who put in about the same time, and there's still a grandson now in the Coast Guard service at the moment. So the life-saving equipment was removed from service in 1989, so they no longer use the method of firing a line to a ship because helicopters have taken away the need, etc. But there's still, you've got the cliff rescue and the search, attached to the Coast Guards. One of my brothers, Frank, he was a member of the Porthleven LSA team in his younger days, and then in 1951 he decided he would like to actually join the Coast Guards, and he became one of Her Majesty's Coast Guards, putting in service in the Orkneys, Scotland, Falmouth. But sadly, poor Frank died at quite a young age, at 54, when he was a Deputy Regional Controller for the Southwest. So he did incredibly well in the service, but sad his life was cut short. But so they were all in the Coast Guards, which was rather lovely.
Oh, the diamond is a
Boat
ship
building,
that has to
net
the
making
straits
and
of
fishing.
Down, and the key it is all.
During the first half of the 19th century, Porthleven expanded dramatically in response to the initial construction of its harbour. Between 1811 and 1825, industries such as boat building, fishing and net making continued to expand.
I've got photographs of at least 50 boats that were built in Porthleven. These are big Lowestoft drifters, so Porthleven had a tremendous reputation for its boat building. The place was thriving. Stanley and Willie Oliver, two brothers, built the magnificent little crabbing boats, crabbers for Coverack and the villages, and you can see them, you can recognise their design today.
Before school in the morning, we used to go rushing over to Briggside Quay and see the boats coming in and see which one had the most fish, because they'd have their holds full of fish. And, they would come groaning through the gateway. And I was quite friendly at the time with Dorothy Richards, whose father, Ralph Richards, was on the Energetic. And we always hoped that the Energetic would have the most fish, and very often they did. And it was wonderful.
The first boat recorded as being built in Porthleven was the Seven Brothers, believed to have been built by James Sandry in 1816. Porthleven boat builders soon had a well-earned reputation for their craftsmanship, and while some boats were built for local use, others were destined to travel to various countries around the world. Two boats called the Fort Churchill and the Fort York were built for the Hudson Bay Company to be used in their fur trading business. There were four main boat-building firms operating at the turn of the century in Porthleven: Sandries, Kittoes, Bowden and Sons, and W.J. Oliver and Sons.
I do feel proud about the achievements of my grandfather. They set it up from nothing, and they built it up to one of the biggest boat building structures in Porthleven. They built boats for Yarmouth, Lowestoft, Ramsgate, and one of the fastest drifters on the east coast at the time was a drifter built by Grantford Bowden. And when we think about all the places that these boats have been and the nautical miles they've put in.
At the peak of boat building in Porthleven during the 19th century, on average, one new boat was launched every 3 weeks. Over 1,600 boats were built in Porthleven. Kittoes alone employed more than 100 shipwrights, 20 apprentices and subsidiary tradesmen.
Well, when I left school, I was only 15. Summer holidays, I had a week off, and then my mother said, I got you an interview down at the boatyard. I see Mr. Oliver, Stanley and Willie. I worked for till November before I was 16, and like two or 3 months before I was 16, before I started my apprenticeship. And after that is a 5-year apprenticeship. And that took me up to, when I was 21, I come out of my apprenticeship, I think I was on about £20 a week.
2 skilled men could build a crabber in 15 to 17 weeks. Boats built in Porthleven had quickly earned their shipyards a fine reputation, resulting in orders being received from far and wide, as well as from local fishermen. The wage for an apprentice shipwright was 2 shillings 10 pence per week for 12-hour days for 6 years.
Outside we had a great big cannon, and then when they launched a boat, they have these great big strops, and they'd be going across the road because the road was closed. They had a crane there, and then that used to up the boat out on the big trolley and down the slip. The slip those days wasn't like it is now, because it was a bit dangerous, because when it got down to the bottom into the harbour, it was a big drop. So the boat would be moved down onto the slip, and then when the tide came in, full tide, they would let it go, and then the trolley would go down and he would launch it.
As Porthleven was chiefly a fishing village, net-making and repair facilities were required. Being vital to the fishermen's livelihood, the nets needed to be well looked after and maintained. Few could handle a needle. Those who could were mainly women, due to the dexterity of their small and nimble hands.
I'm from a net-making family. There were sort of 2 other companies in the village, quite sort of substantial. The family employed from 30 full-time people up to 100 outworkers, and that was running its heyday between the 1920s and the 1950s. So when you think, say, in the village of a smaller village it was then, you could have maybe 100 to 200 people working on nets. It's quite a population, really. When you think of nobody's having to leave the village or travel, they walk to the place of work. It's quite important and quite an economy in the village. It kept many families going all throughout the year. So it's not seasonal work; it's sort of full-time work.
During the war years, Porthleven net makers were commissioned to make netting for the armed forces. The village fishermen were considered to be some of the most adventurous and hardy of the South Coast fishermen, and by 1885 there were over 100 boats fishing out of Porthleven, including 80 pilchard boats, 23 mackerel drivers with 7 men to a boat, and 20 crabbers.
When I started fishing, I left school at 15 and went down St. Ives aboard of a crabber, and that was aboard of the Dos Amigas, going back a few years now. And I stayed there for a bit of while, and before I had my own boat, I was in 2 or 3 different boats, and then I come home, I worked Feather's boat with my Uncle Jack Sutton. Had some fun. He was out there aboard the boat with he. I mixed with maybe Gizzy men and Lou men and Plymouth men, took me all over with he, and down Falmouth fishing a lot, and you yourself, John, was all over too, Newlyn mainly, and had some big catches of fish. I've seen some sights. We've gone out, say, and we've been down there 100 mile, 150 mile down west on the Ling, and lift up the anchor, getting up, and next thing you see the fish floating up. They blow their swim bladders, and up they come to the surface, and you see lings, as far as the eye could see, on top of the surface, swimming. Thousands.
A special net called a seine was used to catch mackerel, pilchards and mullet shoals. The net was usually around 400 to 500 yards long, with floats at the top and weights at the bottom. 2 or 3 boats would work together, and the net was floated into a semicircle, and then closed to encircle the shoal. The fish would then rise to the surface, and be scooped up out of the water and loaded into the boats. The larger fishing boats went to fish in Scottish waters during the herring season, and to Ireland in the mackerel season. Crews were often away for a stretch of 3 months at a time. Fishing has always been a dangerous occupation, and lives were inevitably lost. There was a period of prosperity in fishing following World War I. Fish were plentiful, with several boats landing catches worth around £200 during the pilchard season. In 1919, pilchards were between 5 and 10 a penny. One night, a record catch of 162,000 were landed between 3 boats.
And the fishing, when it was neap tides, we could carve the gear off, have 5 strings of pots. This was with Michael Orchard and David, and go away down back to Cobbank, back to Edgecoast on these scuds down there. But that was like a big excursion for we, because we would work the bay, and to steam down there, sometimes pour a fresh old breeze, and that was a big thing. But we used to wait for the neeps and get down there catching crawfish. And sometimes we would have 80 or 90 crawfish. And I can remember one day, because Cecil Oskin, he used to be down there working as a provider. That was David's father. And I remember coming home down there to the harbour one day, and he said to his dad, "We beat you day, father." So he said, well, how many did he have? He said, we had 100. Well, my son, he said, we had 119. I don't think we ever beat Cecil, but that was some fish then in those days.
The fishing industry was us all the year round. Back in the day when they had the crab factory over at Wellmore, that crab soup they used to do went all round the world and was known as Porthleven crab soup.
The boom did not last long, with the Depression coming along creating a serious decline in the industry. At the same time, there was a decline in fish stocks. Therefore, there was less call for the building of new boats. Whilst new nets were still required, the number diminished, forcing a change in direction for the net makers. The wars created another market, with orders being received from the armed forces. Later, the industry turned to sporting nets. Traditional wooden boats made way for steel, followed by fiberglass. In 1953, the fish merchants Paulin and Sons closed when James and William retired, leaving Porthleven without a fish market. By 1957, the fishing fleet was down to just 26 boats.
Best thing, getting up, going say early, looking at the sky and seeing what a fantastic creator we got, and to be involved with such beauty, to see the sea changing every day, to see the abundance of fish, always small little sprats, right up to basking sharks and whales, to see such the elements changing and see a crab come up in a pot and taking out and say, how can that be that those claws have got so much power? Like a hydraulic ram, they grab fast to be, and you certainly know it. Many things I couldn't describe. I know one thing, I wouldn't change it. I would do it all again if I could. And let me just say this, I think majority of the fishermen are the salt of the earth.
Out along the harbour reach, boats stand dried up on the beach, ghost-like in the early dawn. Empty now, the fish are gone. What will become of people now? Try to build a life somehow. Hard times are back again. No more fish, no fisherman.